As you said, my name is Yassar Dahbour, not Yassar. Yassar, because the reason I insist in this sitting on my name, because pretty much this is the highest qualification that I could address the left. Yassar in Arabic means left. So that's my biggest qualification here to speak about the left. I'm a local activist. I've worked with Sacramento Regional Coalition for Palestinian Human Rights, Palestine American League. Also the chair of Arab American Caucus in the California Democratic Party. And with that, I will pass the mic to Dr. Kaminer.
So I think I'll do it all at the same time. So maybe David can go first.
Yes, it's on. Hi, I'm David Mandel. I've been in Sacramento for going on close to 40 years almost. Before that, I grew up in Chicago, lived in Israel for 10 years in the 70s and 80s, became an Israeli citizen, and was involved in the Israeli independent left that Matan's going to tell you about even before he was born. And I'm now an active member of DSA, co-chair of the International Committee of the chapter. Also involved with Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a national organization. We have a chapter here in Sacramento as well. And I'm in DSA, I'm a member also of the National Working Group for BDS and Palestine, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But just right now I want to call your attention to one of the projects that we are doing. Is I gave a lot of you these cards. It's kind of a BDS Pledge Card, a way to just raise consciousness and know who supports us. So there are more, if you didn't get one, there's more on the table with the red tablecloth. And if you don't mind, and if you agree, please fill out I think it's the bottom part on most of them, though I see some are in reverse, and put it in the basket on the red table or give it to me, and keep the other part to remind you to observe the boycott, which we can talk about more later if we want.
Okay, so hi. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Matan Kaminer. I'm an anthropologist, actually, and I'm not here in an academic capacity, so we can drop the doctor part. Although I am in the U.S. in an academic capacity, I gave a talk at UC Davis yesterday, and I told David that I was coming. He's an old family friend, and he suggested that we do this event. And here I'm here more in my hat that I wear as an activist, and I've been politically active on the left in Israel since I was about 15 years old. Also, kind of a third-generation red diaper baby. So David knew my grandparents and my parents. And so I've been involved. I've been going to demonstrations since I was, I think, four or 5 years old, but I became sort of more active on my own around age when I was a teenager, and more kind of intensively around age 18 when I was called up to serve in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces. This was in 2000, so right around the time that the second Intifada was breaking out. And then I joined a group called the Shministim, which means high school seniors in Hebrew, who were a group of several hundred young people who pledged. We signed a pledge too, not to serve the occupation. Some of us, we refused to serve in the occupied territories, and some of us refused to serve altogether. So, as you might not know, in Israel there's a conscription for Jewish citizens of Israel, which is 80% of the population. The other 20% of the population is Palestinian, and they're exempted. But for Jewish young people, military service is obligatory for women as well as for men. I think it's the only country in the world to do that. And to refuse military service, especially during this periods of intensified conflict, is a very kind of a strong political statement. And quite a few of us were actually sent to prison for that. And I was part of a group of 5 people who were on trial together, and we were sentenced to. We'd spent already 9 months in prison. We were sentenced to another year after that. And after that, after prison, I became involved actually in a lot of migrant solidarity work. So I traveled in South America for a while and learned Spanish. Got involved with the Latin American migrant community in Tel Aviv, and got very interested in this issue of migration. And then when I started actually doing academic research as an anthropologist, I got involved with the community of farm workers from Thailand. So Israel has about the majority of its rural agricultural workforce is a migrant workforce that comes from guest workers from Thailand. This is the past 30 years. It's not the topic of my talk today, but if anybody wants to hear more about migrants and refugees, there's quite a few refugees from East Africa and Israel as well. Maybe we can talk about that later. Fast forward to today, or the last sort of 6 years, I was a co-founder and I'm still a board member in an organization called Academia for Equality, which is a membership organization of academics. Most of us are in Israel, but quite a few are also abroad. And it's an organization of left-wing academics, a grassroots organization, so we're not an NGO or a political party, for that matter. And we have working groups or committees that work on various issues that run from the complicity of Israeli academia in the occupation, which is an interesting topic we can also talk about, to the fight against sexual harassment and assault in academia, which is rife in Israel as in other places, labor issues and unionization of academics, the climate crisis, lots of different things. And we managed to do that, I think, because we're kind of a different kind of organization, which is based in a particular occupation or in a particular kind of a sector of employment, which is academia, but is not a union, and is also not focused on just one topic. So we have this grassroots kind of character because we're all kind of in the same field of employment, and that's how we kind of unify the membership. So I can talk a little bit about that too, if anybody likes. Really, I'm not going to. David said I have 30 minutes to talk. I'm not going to talk nearly that long. I'm going to talk a lot shorter than that because I think we would like to have a dialogue or a trialogue, and also to hear from the audience. Okay. So remind me if I forget later. Thanks. Just raise your hand and I'll remember. Okay. So where was I? Anyway, the independent left, and this is maybe the thing that I would like to talk about the most. Not so much the history, but what it is to be a leftist in Israel today, which is it's a pretty complicated question. And David said when we were talking about doing this event, David said, maybe there are lessons for the American left or for DSA, and I'm a little dubious about that. I'm not sure that there are any direct lessons from our experience. First of all, because we're not so successful. The left in Israel is very small and very marginalized, and second of all, because the contexts are so different. So in my analysis, which I think is shared by most of the people here, Israel is a colonial society, a settler colonial society, which was basically set up on the backs of the Palestinian people, and that is kind of the major thing that you need to understand if you want to understand what else is what's going on in Israel. But, and this is a big but, it's also a society. So it's a capitalist society. There's class exploitation going on within Israel. There are Israelis who are exploiters and Israelis who are exploited. There's gender oppression and violence that goes on in Israel as in other societies. LGBT questions, the ecological crisis, all these things are happening in Israel as they're happening in other places, and people are mobilizing to different extents against all of them. And within Israeli society, as I already mentioned, there's 20% of the population of Israel, of the citizens of Israel, who are second-class Palestinian citizens. And those Palestinian citizens are also politically mobilized in different groups, in different parties. I don't know if anybody's following the news from Israel, but we have currently there's a parliamentary crisis. The government might fall. And the reason that the government might fall, or one of the reasons that the government might fall, is that a Palestinian party, which is in the governing coalition, Ra'am, the Islamist party, is considering backing out of the coalition. There's another Palestinian-led party, the Joint List, which I support, which is a coalition of left and liberal forces within the Palestinian society, which are not in the ruling coalition, and they probably won't be anytime soon. And these are two serious forces that are competing for the voices of Palestinians in Israel. So Palestinians in Israel are they're not homogeneous in their own political stances either. And this is true for Palestinians in the West Bank, and it's true for Palestinians in Gaza Strip, and in the diaspora, and the various parts of the diaspora. Obviously, the camps in Lebanon are very different from North America or from Chile, where there are 500,000 Palestinians. Anyway, I think I've made my point. The fact that both of these societies, Palestinian society and Israeli society, which are intertwined in very complicated ways, are also both very heterogeneous, and in each one of them, there's a kind of multiplicity of forces and multiplicity of struggles that are going on. So I think that's really important to understand. David is handing out these Bds pledge cards, and I think that's really important. I think it's really important to keep piling the pressure on the Israeli state and the Israeli regime, because that's a necessary component of any sort of progress towards decolonization, which is what we need. But another necessary component towards decolonization, and this is where the independent left comes in, is getting some, I would say, not necessarily the majority, but a significant portion of Jewish Israelis on board with the idea. And we're very, very far from that. I think we're farther away than we were 30 years ago when David was in Israel, unfortunately. 40 years ago, yeah. We've been regressing in that respect. Things have gotten worse. The paradigm of separation, which I think Ariel Sharon was the big architect of, meaning that Israelis don't really need to see Palestinians in their everyday lives, which it wasn't that way 40 years ago, because Palestinians were working in Israel, and Palestinians were the borders between the West Bank and Gaza Strip and Israel were open. Now those borders are closed. They're not really borders, but they're closed. Gaza is completely besieged, and in the West Bank it's not completely besieged, but it's under a very, very oppressive combined rule of the Israeli state and of the Palestinian Authority, which basically acts as kind of a subcontractor for Israel in this respect. So Israelis, for the most part, and we're living through a more complicated period in that respect, I can also talk about that, but for the most part, for the last 20 years, since I've been an adult, since the end of the Second Intifada, basically, most Israelis have been able to live their lives as if Palestinians didn't exist, right? And this makes it very easy for Israelis to, ignore the Palestinian question and ignore the fact that they're basically living on the backs of another people. So this has made things a lot harder for the left, and a lot harder for people who want to proceed towards decolonization. In order to make any progress in that respect, I think first of all, maybe this goes without saying, but the protagonistic role in this struggle is that of the Palestinian people. The Palestinians are the ones who are going to have to lead the struggle towards decolonization. The Palestinians themselves, not their allies abroad, and definitely not the Israelis. What we can do is be allies, right? We can support that. But the way that I see what Israelis need to be doing, and I think a lot of Palestinians that I've spoken to about this agree with me, is we need to be working within our own society, right? And we need to be making the case within our own society for the fact that decolonization, democracy, whether it's in a two-state or a one-state paradigm, I don't think that matters so much. But it needs to be equal rights for everybody. There needs to be a right of return. The refugees need to be able to return, and Jerusalem needs to be the capital of Palestine and of Israel if we'd have a two-state solution, whatever. Not getting into all those details because we're very distant from all of that right now. What we Israeli leftists need to be doing, and this is what we're trying to do, is agitating within our own society, as I think the DSA does, and as I think other left-wing parties and groups in other parts of the world do, is saying justice is justice, right? You can't be fighting sexual harassment and assault but not fighting the occupation. You can't be fighting the oppression of LGBT people and not fighting the occupation. You can't be fighting for socialism and not fighting the occupation. And there are people in Israel who think you can do all of those things. They're not necessarily the same people, but I think, but there are people who think you can do each and every one of those things. And I think what being a non-Zionist leftist or an anti-Zionist leftist in Israel means today is to be saying no, that's not a consistent stance, and that's not a consistent politics. And anybody who tries to do a class only or a class reductionist politics in Israel, or anybody who tries to do a liberal feminist politics in Israel, anybody who tries to do even an ecological politics in Israel without taking the Palestinians into consideration and without taking a strong stance against the occupation, is basically eventually going to run up against this wall. That in a colonial society, the nation is above all, right? The cohesiveness or the unity of the nation, which is the Jewish nation, right? That's how Zionism defines it, not the Israeli nation. There's no such thing as an Israeli nation. is what we need to coalesce around, right? And anybody who rocks that boat too much, whether it's because they want to have socialism or because they want to have a gender equal society, etc., will have to get in line. You know, we'll have to put their demands on hold because, you know, a war might break out at any moment. So in 2011, there was this wave of protest throughout the whole world, right? Especially in the Arab world, and later in the US as well. You guys came late. Sorry, Occupy was October. We were already in the streets in June. Israel actually had a really big protest movement too. I think in terms of like percentages of the population that were participating in demonstrations, we were one of the highest in the world. In August, we were in Israel. The main kind of every different places had different catalysts for the protest movements in 2011. In Israel, it was the housing issue. You know. Housing is still, but it was really in a kind of crisis situation in 2011, and lots of people, especially young people, were out in the streets demonstrating and occupying streets, you know, and setting up tent camps, demanding a solution. They were demanding social justice, taking a lot of inspiration actually from the Arab Spring. So the famous chant of the Egyptian protesters, "Sha'ab yurid isqat al-nizam," the people demand the downfall of the regime, was kind of adapted by Israelis to say "Ha'am doresh tzedek chavarti," so the people demand social justice, right? And that was a very explicit borrowing from the Egyptian protesters that we were really admiring and really kind of taking our cue from. Anyway, you might be able to guess what happened. A sort of security situation was concocted by the Netanyahu government. He was prime minister back then too. And there were some attacks across the border around the Gaza area and around Eilat in the south, and the government was really very clear to saying to people, look, you got to go home now, right? Because there's a war on. It didn't actually develop into a war, thank God, but it was very clearly being used, and we knew it was coming. You know, a lot of the more sophisticated people in the streets knew it was coming, that they were going to create some sort of security situation in order to send us all home. And this is not the first time that it's happened in Israeli history, and it's probably not the last time either. So, the independent left. I'm just going to say a few words about that because there's a book. It's in Hebrew, but the introduction has been translated into English, and you can all read it if you're interested. It appeared on 972, which is an excellent English language site about Israel-Palestine. So this was the Israeli version of what was called the New Left, I think, in the West. Before that, we had a Zionist left in Israel, which many people would say is not really a left at all. And there was a pro-Soviet kind of communist left. It was majority Palestinian, but also had some Jews in it. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a bunch of organizations appeared, which were neither. Right? They were neither Zionist nor pro-Soviet. They were taking their inspiration from the New Left in the West, and they were taking and they were inspired by feminism and inspired by a kind of anti-imperialist stance that other New Left movements were taking abroad. And we were discussing this. I think a lot of this is in the DNA of DSA as well. So it's not. I think we all share some basic values, which are socialism, but also democracy, right? So we're all for taking over the means of production. I think we can say that, right? But in a democratic way. And we can talk about what that means. Obviously, there's yet another question, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to finish pretty soon. I think Academia for Equality, the group that I belong to, I've already given some instances of the work that we've been doing. We also take this kind of this idea that the left needs to be broadly active on all fronts where injustice exists, right? And because we live in a colonial society, then we need to have we need to be particularly involved in solidarity with the colonially oppressed, which includes the Palestinian citizens of Israel, many of whom are students and fewer of whom are faculty in Israeli universities. So that's actually an active front that we're always working on. The recent security escalation that's been going on in past couple of weeks or months already has had a direct impact on Palestinian students in Israeli universities who are being faced with all sorts of bullying and kind of threats of violence by right-wing organizations that are also present on campuses. So we're doing a lot of work with them to maintain solidarity with them and to help out behind the scenes. We have connections with university kind of administrations and keeping. I think this is. It sounds maybe banal or not very political, but this is the kind of day-to-day stuff that you need to do. Students are they're afraid to come to classes, so you need to talk to their professors to make sure that they don't get their grade lowered because they didn't come to class. That sort of thing. Everyday stuff, and. In academia, I think academia is in some senses considered. And I'm getting to your question. In some cases, it's considered in some ways academia for those of us who haven't experienced it is seen as the sort of ivory tower or something that's disconnected from the rest of society, where things maybe are belonging to this sector is considered some sort of privilege. And there are aspects of that which are true, but academia also has lots of very kind of particular issues which have to do with they have to do with neoliberalism, which is of course all across society, but they also have to do with these very kind of paternalistic and kind of patronage-based networks that we have in academia. So if you're for example a PhD student, you're really dependent on your advisor, right? And if your advisor is sexually harassing you or even assaulting you, then it might be even harder to find recourse than it is in other fields of employment. So this is why one of our most active kind of groups within Academia for Equality has been the group that's been fighting against sexual harassment and assault in academia. And that is, it's not the work that I've been most closely involved in, but it's really important work that we've been doing for the last, say, 4 years. And here too, there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes work. You hear about a particular case, you try to get it resolved. You don't write about it in the newspaper, you don't publish it on your website, but I think it's important political solidarity work that we're doing, right? And then of course there's more public stuff that we are involved in. For example, very hard lobbying of the universities to set up kind of equality ombuds people to make sure that gender equality is enforced in the universities, and after those offices are set up, to make sure that the right people are kind of appointed to them, and then making sure that those people do their jobs, right? Neither of these stages is in any way trivial, and there's a lot of work that goes into doing all those things. So that's just one example. I think we're doing this kind of a lot of the work that we're doing is not so like dramatic or even, I think, from people who are outside the country, might not even be seen as being like doing the most important stuff. But and I'll finish on this note. To be an effective left, I think you need to be able to reach out to people in the community that you're working in, and to show them that you're working in their interests, right? People will be a lot more open to hearing about the occupation from you if they've already seen you, standing up for their rights as workers, standing up for their rights as women in the workplace, standing up for other issues that they believe in, such as fighting the climate crisis, which we're in a very backward state in Israel. So all of these things, I think, you need to be very, very closely kind of integrated within your community in order to make any sort of effect. And I think those are the words I'll end on, because sometimes you hear on social media, you hear all sorts of things, right? And sometimes people with very kind of marginal stances can still be amplified. So something that I've heard recently, and it's not the first time that I've heard it, is this idea that if you're a Jewish person and you're a Jewish citizen of Israel and you're against the occupation, you're against colonialism, the best thing you can do is get out, leave, go live somewhere else. And I think that's false. I think that's wrong. I think, again, if we're trying to aspire to any sort of democratic decolonization, and I think that is what we're aspiring to, the kind of Algeria scenario is not going to happen in Palestine. The Israelis are not just going to pack up and leave. Even if people think that's desirable, it's just not going to happen. So the way that decolonization can happen, and this is obviously a long shot too, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 10 years. But when it happens, if it happens, it will be In the South African case is relevant here. We can discuss that. It will be because a big portion of the Jewish Israeli society will have realized that it is also in their interest. It is also something that they want to do. That they want to live in they want to live in a country which is a democratic country, which doesn't discriminate between people on the basis of their race or nationality. And in order for that to happen, then there need to be people there all the time making that case. Even in the hardest days and the darkest of times, there need to be people there who are making that case and who don't leave the stage to the far right, who are just as happy to see us all leave. So I'll end on that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start briefly give you some background about myself. So I'm a Palestinian. Probably. Yeah, right. Let's struggle with this one. All right. So I was born in Syria. I'm from the city of Haifa, and my family left in 1948 upon the establishment of Israel. Ended up in a refugee camp in Syria, and that's where I grew up until 1984, when we left, when the PLO was challenged in Syria by breakaway factions. We ended up going to Tunis, and we went through the Palestinian diaspora before I came to the United States. My family went back to Palestine after the Oslo Agreement, and I ended up here in colleges, naturally, having grown up within the confines of the PLO. Naturally, I was an activist, natural-born activist. Thank you. You did warn us. So what I'm trying to give you here, again, I wanted to clarify that because I'm not one of the Palestinian. See, Palestinian now population, you could classify them based on the politics into three different kind of Palestinians groups. Those who lived in the 1948 area, who remained on whatever you want to call proper Israel, although it's not has no defined boundaries, but those who carry the Israeli citizenship. Those who live in the West Bank and Gaza remain under Israeli occupation, yet they have that odd situation. They're not Israeli citizen, and they're not Palestinian, or maybe they're Palestinian under the Palestinian Authority that the Israeli are not talking to, and they're supposed to be engaged in a peace talk, but it's going nowhere. It hasn't gone anywhere since 1993. And then you have the Diaspora Palestinians. And those are originally about 750,000 Palestinians who were expelled from Palestine upon the establishment of Israel, ended up living in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and throughout the world. And those are the majority of Palestinians. As a matter of fact, there are different statistics about Palestinians. They range from 12 to 20 millions, but nothing is accurate because there is no good census to really track all the Palestinians around the world. But what we know for sure that those Palestinians who are accounted for outside of Palestine, historical Palestine, are more than those who exist in Palestine. And the Palestinian, just to give you some geographical information and demographical information, Palestinians who remain in historical Palestine between the West Bank, Gaza, and the 1948 area are roughly equivalent to the number of, or to the population of the Israelis. So when it comes to the questions of left, I'm going to be providing the Palestinian perspective, the mainstream Palestinian perspective on the Israeli left. Originally, when before Israel was established, the first settlement that was built in Palestine, Petah Tikva, right? That was the first one, and Petah Tikva. Yeah.
One of the first ones.
I think, at least so I learned. And is it Petah Tikva, literal translation would be key of hope or something to that effect?
Gateway to hope.
Gate for the hope. So this was established way before Israel was established as a settlement And the early is, Western, at the time there's no Israelis, the Western pioneers from the Israeli perspective who came to Palestine, because, the Israeli project started, at least was pronounced in 1897 after the Basel conference in Switzerland in 1897, calling for the establishment for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so these migrants start coming to Palestine, some of them living in kibbutz, and which for some European, it was like Western romanticism with socialism, wanting to live in labor or communal groups and have self-sufficiency and establish a new state. But fast forward to the Israeli, to 1948 and the establishment of Israel. Now, the majority of Palestinians were expelled. Those who remained behind either left to the West Bank, Gaza, or the surrounding countries. Those who remained in 1948 Palestine were oppressed. They had no political outlet. One thing I should mention here, the Palestinian Communist Party actually predates the State of Israel. And it existed, and it found a natural political outlet and common grounds with the Israeli Communist Party. And that's when we found, some of the pioneers like Tawfiq Toubi, Emil Habibi, Tawfiq Ziyad. Those are some of the early, Palestinian leaders in the 1948 area. And they wanted to have, first and foremost, a political outlet to be the spokespeople for the Palestinian, because they could not have a Palestinian party in this new entity that was formed upon them. And those people were actually caught between two fires. They were caught between, from the Palestinian perspective, the extreme, the mainstream, they were collaborators because they joined the occupier. And from the Israeli side, the mainstream of the Israeli side, they were not accepted, at least in the beginning. So they were between two fires. As politics became more complicated and more sophisticated in Israel, and you have what we call to differentiate between what Matan was talking about, the independent left, and the mainstream left. I want to call it the governmental left. Those who formed parties like the Mapam, like later on that Mapam became Meretz, and so on. So we want to differentiate here a little bit, because there is quite a lot of difference. Namely, what Matan was referring to, the independent left, he's talking about those who rejected Zionism, who were more sympathetic with the Palestinians and more leaning towards peaceful resolution of the situation. From Palestinian perspective, it was hard to build common grounds with the socialists, because Palestinian in the beginning, you have the Palestinian Liberation Front of Palestine, you have the Democratic Liberation Front of Palestine, you have the Communist Party, you have many leftist organizations. The question for them, the ethical question, especially when we talk about the socialism, the Soviet era, communism, it was really hard to find common ground with the Israeli left or the governmental left. Because when you're talking about egalitarianism, when you talk about social justice, redistribution of wealth, the basic question for Palestinian was, what wealth are you talking about? If we're talking about socioeconomic perspective, what economic resources you're talking about? You're talking about, from our perspective, stolen resources that Palestinians were deprived from and are handed to foreigners who came, occupied our countries, and pushed us down to second-class citizens. And pretty much, it's a colonial and what we call it, I don't call it Palestinian conflict, it's the theft of Palestine. Because we were, over a period of time, dispossessed of everything we own, even from our identity. And we became refugees outside and inside our own land. And we became, and those who remain in Israel became later on second-class citizen. As you know, there are many laws that assure that they have that place in the society. And that's something we could talk about later. So for the Palestinian left to build bridges with the Israeli left, it was really hard, except for a few exceptions. And I think I read a new article and kind of reminded me during the first Lebanon War in 1982, there was a declaration issued by both the Democratic Liberation Front of Palestine and Matzpan. And that was unprecedented. And although the stage was set for it on the Palestinian side from 1974, when they talk about the forming what they call the intermittent program of the PLO, and that is the PLO from liberating historical Palestine, accepted to talk about liberating any parts of Palestine, to establish Palestinian homeland, and on the way for the liberation of Palestine. And that actually caused a division and schism within the PLO. Later on, and I just want to go back actually to defining the left in Israel too. The left in Israel mostly was a political definition. Like even when we talked about the Mapam, or when we talk about, it was a political more than a socioeconomic definition. It was actually a definition of those parties that were more leaning towards the peaceful resolution of the situation that existed. But that, unfortunately, has been dwindling and has been, over the time, I mean, now in Israel, we have a government that is right-wing government whose opposition is more right-winger. I mean, merits that the remaining is bona fide Israeli governmental left. It has 6 seats right now, right?
Out of 120.
Out of 120. So there, within the government of Israel, it's actually massively one of the most right-wing government you will ever see. There is no governmental left right now. And even Meretz right now, it doesn't have a genuine socialist, socioeconomic program in itself. It's really just, it's leaning towards the peaceful resolution of the conflict that really is the program.
And it's part of the coalition.
Yeah.
It is part of the coalition, that's right.
It's trailing the far right.
Right. So to go back, the question of the other thing. So I was talking about establishing the bridges between the left on both sides, the predicament or the problems. So I did mention the theft of the land, what resources, what economic resources, what equal distribution of wealth we're talking about. If you didn't own the wealth to start with, and you have somebody coming from Russia, from England, from Poland, from United States, from Latin America, from Africa, taking over our wealth as Palestinian. So what wealth is there to distribute? You're distributing a wealth that doesn't belong to you, and not to the people of the land who rightfully owned it. The other thing, again, talking about mainstream. Two-state solution versus one-state solution. That is a very important thing. A two-state solution, it proved time and again, it's not doable. And as a matter of fact, Israel killed it. And it's, as we're speaking right now, they're building 1,500 more settlements or units in the Israeli settlements within the West Bank to make sure that that solution will not be there and will not be fathomable or doable or feasible. So for the Palestinian left, the one-state solution, really, it originated with the Palestinian left. They were the first ones to speak about it. And we're saying, okay, as Matan was saying, those Israelis who came to the land now between 1948 and the migration, mind you, started way before that, until now, 2022. There are generations who were born and grew up there, and they know no other place to call home except that piece of land. And that is understandable. So I think if I were to say the reconciliation between both sides of the lefts did not happen, did not take place. The Israeli lefts having come to admit or to adopt these principles to lay a foundation to establish bridges with the Palestinian left, which I believe could be really powerful. The other thing, and most importantly, actually before all of that, predicament why bridges were not established, until now, and as Matan said, like, yes, it was wrong, they came, but until now, there is no Israeli party or group would admit to the original sin. We're still here. They talk about everything. Sometimes having selective citation of history. And here I'm talking about general, of course. I'm not saying everybody, but in general. But they don't talk about the theft of the land, the fact that these stories were made up about Palestine and whether there is history, there is not history. The fact that some people come to our land and say, 4,000 years ago we were here and we have ties to it. Well, great. So are the Christians and so are the Muslims. Wonderful. But, and it's great to have, in usual circumstances, if Palestine was independent, we want to establish, these kind of ties between the Jewish worldwide to at least have some tourists coming to visit, Jewish sites in Palestine. We would want it, but not in a way to come and deprive us and steal our land and call us strangers.
And there were always Jews living there before land.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, there has been Jewish presence within Palestine. I'll tell you stories. My grandmother used to tell us stories. She's from the village of Shajara, now called Ilana, I believe, or Sagra. It's next to Tiberias in the north. She talked about having a Jewish village nearby where, some older women would call upon the Muslim kids playing in the street on the Shabbat to help them, to run some errands because they cannot do work on the Shabbat. So that was normal. That was life. It was, Palestine was open for all. But I do have, quite a few points, but I think I talked too long, more than I expected. And I would rather actually continue with the dialogue. So I'll stop at this point and I'll pass the mic.
Thank you both so much. That was wonderful, and you both are extremely well-spoken and extremely knowledgeable, and I feel like I learned a lot. And I really appreciate how Yassar, you spoke to just the sense that early political Zionism in the establishment of Israel, there was a sense that it was socialist. And I think that, I think we all know that everyone who calls themselves a socialist is not necessarily a socialist, but it's always important to really get down to the principles of, where does the wealth come from? It comes from nature and the people putting that wealth into movement. And if the wealth is stolen, then it isn't socialism if it's not being, if not everyone is included from the beginning. And Matan, when you were speaking about your work in academia with sexual harassment, I know you mentioned that it's not the kind of work that necessarily gets a lot of press or anything like that, but I just wanted to say that at least what I have found as an organizer within DSA is 90% of the work is just developing direct relationships with people, because you can't really build anything without doing that. And so by doing that direct support and just doing that kind of relational organizing builds power quite a bit. So thank you both. Another round of applause for both Matan and Yassar. David, do you want to add anything or speak on anything?
Well, again, thanks both of you. I agree with what you said, Claire. I would just like to, and this can go in whatever direction people want, but very briefly, I just want to talk about why it's important for us to think about this both as DSA and about American citizens. As you probably know, pretty much our government is heavily invested in maintaining the Israeli occupation and the Israeli rule over the Palestinians, to the tune of $4 billion a year, almost all of which is military aid, huge subsidy for the American military industry, among other things. But also politically, Palestine and Israel is one of many places around the world where the United States is carrying out policies to maintain its own economic, political, military domination throughout the world. And as DSA, I think this is something that I believe that we need to pay more attention to, just internationalism in general, because there's very little. Sometimes we get really focused on Medicare for all and labor organizing and housing rights and reproductive rights and all those things, and sometimes we forget the connections. And Palestine is just an important example where there's there's historically been a lot of support for Israel, including on the liberal left in this country, including historically in DSA. And that's something that I think is important to overcome, both for our own consciousness and our own consciences, but also because the United States, as much as it acts as an imperialist power, can be responsive to public pressure. And if we work to change public opinion on this and other issues regarding international affairs, eventually our goal is to have a totally different society, a socialist society here. But even in the interim, there are times when the U.S. ruling class has been responsive to pressure from below on international and other issues. And that's a lot of what I'm working on, just for my own personal history of having lived there for 10 years and being an American Jew and trying to focus in particular on changing opinions within the American Jewish community. I think that there's good work to be done and some real potential. And I think if you look at some of the surveys that have gone on in the last few years, there has been a really big change in public opinion among progressives, among younger people in particular, and among American Jews, of seeing that what's been going on in the Israeli rule over Palestine, the militarism, the occasional bombings, intense bombings of Gaza, the attacks on civilians, the exploitation in so many ways of the captive population, and the refusal to recognize basic human rights of Palestinians, including the right to return for those who were kicked out for 1948 or since, because there have been plenty who were kicked out since then as well. These are things that are not okay and that we need to call attention to the public and oppose. And the Palestine/BDS working group in DSA has been at the forefront of working and raising the consciousness of these things within DSA and doing some important work educational work that I've been glad to be involved in. There's been a lot of controversy because there's been some pushback. There's been some ugly scenarios over electoral things. You probably followed the instance with the demand to expel Jamal Bowman, where there's a lot of pushback on that. And I don't want today to get into the nitty-gritty or the sides on that. I myself was kind of in a middle position, but I think that this is important work, and I hope that it will be able to continue and to become a more smooth-running part of DSA nationally and also in our local chapter. And I'm glad we're having this event this evening to bring some education, some consciousness on the subject. I co-chair the Chapter International Committee. I'd love to see more people involved. Of course, we try to do some educational work, not only on this issue, but on others as well. And I think that's really important work, and I'd love to see some more involvement in it.
Thank you,
Oh, I think if you didn't hear that, yeah, there's a big bag of blankets over there. If anybody would like that somebody brought, if you'd like to take one and drape it over yourself to help keep warm as things cool off with the darkness, that would be great. Fortunately, it's not been raining. Yay.
No, I'm glad we got the rain out of the way earlier today. I was very anxious about it. I'm happy it's gone. So I'm going to kind of open up our discussion panel. When I read your work, Matan, the foreword to what is your book in 972? Yes, thank you. Sorry. Mix up numbers frequently. I had never heard the phrase democratic decolonization before. And so hearing that and trying to conceptualize what that looked like is challenging for me because I cannot think of a decolonization example historically that was democratic, if that makes sense. And maybe it's because I'm ignorant and have a lot to learn. But I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, what that would look like.
Well, just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's impossible, right? That's the dream that we keep alive, I think, in terms of socialism, right? Also, there's never been a totally successful socialist revolution, and there's never been a totally democratic decolonization, but there are, I think, some partial examples which are very important to think through and to learn from. Maybe the most obvious of which being South Africa, right? Which the process of decolonization in South Africa is something that the BDS campaign draws on quite explicitly, right? Because international boycott of the apartheid regime in South Africa played an important part. It's actually kind of controversial how important. I think a lot of South African activists will tell you that they did most of the heavy lifting, and not the world community. But I think it definitely did play an important part, and the demand for democracy was central to the fight against apartheid. And South Africa and Israel Palestine are different in a lot of ways, right? The white minority in South Africa is a minority. It's I think less than 15% of the population. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm correct about that. Whereas, as Yassar mentioned, if you look at the population within the country of Palestine, Israel at the moment, it's about half and half, right? And then there's also those migrants and refugees who are neither Palestinian nor Israeli and who barely have a voice in this conversation at all. And I think it's important to think about them as well. So when I talk about democratic decolonization, there's several aspects to this. I think two aspects primarily. The first one is the more obvious one, which is a democracy in the liberal sense, right? One person, one vote, right? And equal rights. So whether you have a two-state solution or a one-state solution, and I completely agree with Yassar that Israel is the one which has been making the two-state solution impossible, right? Unfortunately, I'm not seeing the one-state solution as any closer right now. I think we're about equally distant from both, which is very distant. Which is why I don't like getting into these discussions, because they seem very utopian and speculative to me. What's important are the principles, right? And the principles are A, equal rights for everybody in the country. B, right of return and return of all the property that's been stolen, right? All the land and urban property and all of that. And C, the dismantling of the structures of oppression, ranging from the wall in the West Bank, ranging from the kind of imprisonment of the population of the Gaza Strip, and all the rest of it. I don't need to get into the details because I was a bit sidetracked here, and I was trying to give a short answer. It's getting long. So A is the liberal concept of one person, one vote, and equal rights. That's democracy, right? B is this question of restitution and reparation, right? Which is Yassar brought this up, and you also hooked into that, which is if we want to talk about socialism, I think we do want to talk about socialism, right? Because people in Israel are experiencing class oppression. It's a capitalist society, and it's a vastly unequal capitalist society. It's one of the most unequal societies among the advanced capitalist societies, close to the U.S. in that respect. Not quite as bad, but almost. So I think we do need to talk about socialism in the Israeli case. But as both of you said, you can't call it socialism when it's only one part of the population, right? When it's only one part of the historical population of the country that's included in that socialism. You can't have a socialism among a minority. That's not socialism, right? And I think this also applies to what David was saying at the global level, right? You can't have socialism in one country, right? It's been tried. And socialism in the U.S., if it wasn't extended globally, and if it wasn't part of a global wave of revolution towards socialism, it wouldn't really be socialism. It would just be a different way of divvying up the spoils of empire, right? And that is why internationalism and that is why anti-imperialism are so important, right? Maybe it bears saying in the context of the Ukraine war that this is not that there are other imperialisms as well. And being anti-U.S. imperialism doesn't mean that you're exempted from being against other imperialisms such as Russian and Chinese imperialism. But you are living in the U.S. and you need to be very, very clear as to your opposition to American imperialism and the close connection, which David also pointed out, to what's going on in Israel, Palestine, right? So that is what I mean by democratic decolonization. It's a lot. It's not something that we're going to achieve tomorrow, right? But I think as socialists, we need to have ultimate goals, right? You can do tactics and you can do strategy if you have ultimate goals, if you have ultimate principles that you're reaching towards. And democratic decolonization is one of those principles. It's not something that's going to be achieved tomorrow, but it is something that's worth fighting for. I think it's something that's worth dedicating entire lifetimes of activism towards, and that's what I mean by it.
I want to add, actually, at least to the understanding of some people. One of those times I was talking, about the situation there, and somebody suggested to me, said, how come, based on the right of returns that I had explained to him, that basically if you're Jewish and you go to Israel upon arrival, you could be a Israeli citizen if you want to be, the Aliyah and all that stuff. So my the person I was speaking to said, if that's the case, why don't all Palestinians convert to Judaism and go to Israel and take over the government, and which makes sense, in a utopian world, I guess. But no, seriously, I mean, I understand what Matan is saying.
Don't worry, there's contingency plans to make sure.
Oh, there is, huh? There are some rabbis with verdicts ready for to nullify our Jewishness. No, but I wanted to talk about actually democratic decolonialism. That's a mouthful. I guess there's no one effort that really decolonize a country. I mean, if you want to have a revolution, you have to have the culture ready for it. If you want to have a rebellion, you have to prepare the people to accept the outcome of the revolution. So maybe by itself as a method is not enough, but it's certainly important to inject the society with that understanding or that trajectory of the social movement in the country. So that I understand. I mean, we need to put the effort in activism with it through democracy, institutions, NGOs, every way, militancy, whatever it takes, until you achieve that critical point where the people are ready for a change. Because if you have a revolution without the social setting is ready for it, then you might be calling for an oppression, and civil war afterwards.
I just wanted to follow up on what Yassar said. I think one of the fantasies of some of the early Zionists, when they realized that this wasn't a land without a people, that there were actually people living there, is that, well, they must be the descendants of the original Jews who lived there, just converted maybe to Christianity or to Islam, and once we come and create this new country, they'll all just join us and become Jews. It was, I don't think there were too many who took that seriously, but there were some people who actually said that. What?
Ben-Gurion thought that.
Ben-Gurion thought that for a while. Okay, yeah. in a way. But I did want to add one thing about the democratic decolonization. I think one reason why it's really important in this instance is because unlike most other colonies, including settler colony situations, including South Africa, where you mentioned the ratio was of whites was much smaller, and now Israeli Jews and Palestinians actually living in the whole country now, including the occupied territories, is about 50-50. That in itself, I think, says that this needs to be, well, it needs to be democratic in any event. But I think the main thing I wanted to say about that is this is kind of a lengthy discussion we had when we founded the organization that I was involved in the 70s, and Matan, I guess as a teenager, it was still around, said, is this a colonial conflict or is this a national conflict? And we went kind of round and round and really came to a conclusion and actually wrote a position paper saying that it was really both, that unlike in most other colonial situations, most of the Israeli Jews came not because they wanted to be settlers or because they chose to displace the Palestinians, but because many of them were forced out of the countries that they were in, or were refugees after World War II, had nowhere else to go, and in the course of time, they had become they had developed a national identity as Israeli Jews, which, may arguably said about South African whites. I certainly don't think it was about Algerian French people or many other colonial situations, and therefore, we said that the conflict is really both colonial and national, and that therefore the process of colonization needs to take into account the fact that there are two nationally identified groups in the country who need to aspire to all the things that Matan said, of the equality and the end of all the oppressive elements, and of course the right of Palestinians to return, those who were dispossessed of their land and property and their homes.
Thank you, David. When I think about international socialism and also South Africa and the decolonization there, I think of Cuba and the amount of support that Cuba under Castro actually gave both militantly and otherwise to support the decolonization of South Africa, especially in the surrounding countries. And so when I hear from you, Matan, that there's such a large Palestinian diaspora, and when we see resurgences of socialism in South America, for example, in Chile, like you mentioned, I think that there is a strong future for international support of decolonization, and I don't think that's incompatible with democratic decolonization at all. I think that it takes efforts from all sides. So that's what I have to say about that. My next question was for Yassar. You talked a lot about see you shortly. You talked about the divides between the Israeli and Palestinian left for very reasonable reasons. And I'm curious if you think that everyone would be in a different position today had that divide been made smaller, or if that was even possible at the time. Do you think that there was a way in which the divide could have been shrank, or was that just truly the nature of reality at that time? Was there anything that organizers in either the Israeli left or the Palestinian left could have done differently to bring folks together, or was it one of those situations where it was truly a situation where things were incompatible?
So back to what I said, I differentiated between two camps in the Israeli left. What Matan was calling the independent left, that was really, for the most part, outside the government, and the Israeli left that was in the government, meaning Mapam, Labour Party, Meretz, and the like. Those, aside probably, from Meretz, well, even Meretz, I mean, Zionism is still ingrained there, meaning the Zionist project of establishing a Jewish homeland at the expense of Palestinian was ingrained. And that is a principle that you cannot overcome. So if you're talking about, the independent left that Matan is talking about really hasn't had the power even within Israel. It was actually fought within Israel. And they've been marginalized, and they've been, they paid hefty price, the refuseniks, those who refused, serving in the Israeli army, the the women in black, they were not mainstream Israeli. So the Israeli left as a governmental power never really materialized in a way to carry principle that could abridge the difference with the Palestinian side. If anything, like on the Palestinian side, the leftists were like PFLP, Palestinian Liberation Front of Palestine, Democratic Liberation of Palestine. They were actually more, PFLP mainly, were more radical. And it was, second only to Fatah in the 70s. It was really a force to reckon with back then. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, when all the left pretty much went south, and now they're numbered. And so really there never been an opportunity because, again, as I mentioned, there wasn't a genuine left in Israel. We're talking about political left, not a social left. Whereas actually in Palestinian, we're talking about Marxist-Leninists, we're talking about, communists. They were bona fide, socialist from that perspective. So, in principle, yeah, but there wasn't an Israeli counterpart that is powerful enough to strike a deal or make a bridge to the Palestinian. Had it come, maybe it would have been a ground for some negotiation or some peaceful resolution. But I'm not going to talk about theory here.
Thank you, Yassar. Does anyone in the audience have any questions and want to come up here and ask them? Please come up here and line up.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I'm Lillian, she, her pronouns. I'm actually Jewish myself. And one thing that actually led me to be anti-Zionist was how there wasn't really a lot of space for critique of Zionism within the American Jewish community. And it just, has there been struggles by the anti-Zionist left and outreach to American Jewish communities, the more mainstream stuff? Because I feel like part of the Zionist narrative is this idea that the Jewish diaspora is basically Israelis in waiting. So with stuff like the nifty birthright trips before bar and bat mitzvahs. So what struggle, what obstacles have the anti-Zionist Israeli left faced in reaching in sort of outreach to diaspora Jews, if that was even a priority at all, which, I understand there's a lot of internal stuff.
You want to speak to that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the U.S. Jewish left?
Is that for me or for David? Either one.
Well, you can. In his last sentence, he asked about the Israeli anti-Zionist left. I think it's important, first of all, to realize that Zionism, when it was created in the late, as a movement in the late 19th, very end of the 19th century, was a small minority of the Jewish people in Europe or anywhere, but it was initially a European movement. It was a response to the really intense anti-Semitism of that period, including sometimes very violent anti-Semitism. But the more common response to that was either to emigrate. There was a mass emigration to Western Europe, to the United States. That's when my ancestors came to this country, maybe yours too. Or also to join left-wing movements. There was a huge Jewish presence in the developing socialist movement of that era. Zionism was a pretty small thing. I think very few people thought that it was at all realistic. It became more realistic when the Zionist movement had showed that it had some appeal based on a real emotional connection that Jews had, as vague as it was, with the land of Israel, but also when it became aligned with it tried very hard with several imperialist powers, but then there was the very well-known Balfour Declaration in 1917 that gave the stamp of approval and British backing to the creation of a Jewish homeland. I'm not going to go through that whole history, but I think it's just the point is that it was a pretty small minority movement to begin with, and that was even true until I think 1948 in the United States among American Jews, and even to a large degree until 1967, when all of a sudden there was this wave of pride in Israeli military victories and without really thinking about the implications, to the point where I was a teenager at that point, and I could see around me that a dedication to Israel and supporting Israel and identifying with Israel was in a way becoming kind of the new religion of mostly secular American Jews. And you grew up, you're a little younger than I am, you grew up after that had already taken place. So it's a relatively new phenomenon, and I don't think it's strongly ideologically based. I think it's hundreds of miles wide, but maybe millimeters deep, this identification with Zionism, which in itself is a difficult thing to articulate because the word means so many different things to different people as well. It's, in the general public it means vaguely support for Israel, and again, anti-Zionism and anti-Israel. But there is a very strong Jewish establishment supported by, I think, the members of the ruling class who are Jewish, or a pretty small number, who have built a politics around supporting Israel and are trying very hard to conflate being anti-Zionist with being anti-Semitic, with being anti-Jewish. And that's something that has become very pervasive. Just a couple of weeks ago, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, which masquerades as a civil rights organization, but is mostly into surveillance and repression and building support for Israeli government, he came out with a statement saying, yes, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which hadn't been stated so explicitly by his organization in the past, and really particularly accusing three organizations, one of them Jewish Voice for Peace, of being basically treasonous to the Jewish people. The others were CARE, the Council on Arab-American Islamic Relations, and Students for Justice in Palestine. But I think that was, if anything, an act of desperation, because I think he and his organization see that this is no longer really working very well, particularly among young Jews, and among that they're seeing through it, and that we are seeing a reversal beginning, and there's a long way to go, but a lot of people are no longer willing to accept this conflation of, well, if you're Jewish, therefore you have to be pro-Israel. And in my work, I run into this all the time, and we fight against it, and we're making some headway. And it's, I think, an important campaign within the Jewish community that we're engaged with, and I think we have a good chance of really increasing our success in that area. Does that sort of respond to what you were saying?
Yeah, I just want to add a few things to what David was saying. I think it's really important to make this distinction between Zionism and Jewishness, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and the sort of historical consciousness is really important to doing that. David mentioned that American Jewry really gets behind Zionism as in force only after 1967. And it's no coincidence at all that U.S. imperialism also really gets behind Israel post-1967. Maybe this is not as well known, but in the 50s and early 60s, the U.S. was playing a much more sort of balanced game between Israel and the Arab states, and Israel was much more closely allied with the U.K. and France. Right, so in 1956, the Sinai War is a war that that Israel, the U.K. and France all undertake together against the Egyptians, against the Nasser regime. And it's really only after the victory of the 1967 war that Israel becomes a U.S. client state, right? And and that happens. I'm not saying exactly what the causal relations are here, but mainstream U.S. Jewish organizations only swing behind Israel to that extent at the same time as the U.S. is doing it for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with love of the Jewish people, which are entirely reasons of imperial kind of raison d'etat and geopolitics, right? And fighting and to mention things that Yassar pointed out earlier, fighting the Arab left and fighting the Arab regimes which were closer to the Soviet Union, right, and which were closer to the other side of the Cold War. So this is Cold War politics, and today the support for Israel among the U.S. in the U.S. I don't need to tell you this. I'm sure you know it. It's much higher among evangelical Christians than it is among Jews, right? Especially in the younger generation. So Zionism is not necessarily a primarily Jewish phenomenon. And in fact, if you want to look at the historical kind of predecessors of Zionism, you have people like John Adams, who was president of the U.S., right, and various people in Britain in the early 19th century. Before any Jews had thought of this, they were already thinking of let's send the Jews to Palestine so we can have an imperial bulkhead of Europe in the Middle East before any Jews were even thinking of it, right?
And not for the love of the Jews.
Exactly, not out of love for the Jews, right? So I think all of this history is really important to remember. And then there's another aspect to it. I think this is maybe getting a little bit closer to the kind of the direct import of your question, which is that in Israel, and the kind of the connections between anti-Zionist left or critical left in Israel and in the U.S. with regard to this question, is that Jewishness means something pretty different in Israel from what it does in the U.S. It's important to understand, right? In Israel, the state decides whether you're Jewish or not. This is why I was kind of joking with Yassar earlier. If the Palestinians decide all to convert to Judaism, it's not going to be that easy. There's actually a pretty famous case of a singer, Nasrin Qadri, who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel singer, who tried to convert to Judaism, and the rabbis basically told her, no, we're not letting you convert, okay? So the rabbinate is an organ of the Israeli state. There's no separation of synagogue and state in Israel. Israel is a theocracy in many ways, right? And this question of who is a Jew is very closely regulated by the state itself. It has a lot to do with immigration from the former Soviet Union, of course, right? But many mixed families came to Israel, and a lot of those people there, even if they consider themselves Jewish, they're not considered Jewish by the state, and this creates a lot of problems for them. They're also sort of second-class citizens, not maybe third-class citizens like the Palestinian citizens, but the point is here. For me, growing up in Israel, I was defined as a Jew by somebody else, right? By the state. Maybe I'd rather not be a Jew, right? I have friends in Israel who say, I'm not Jewish, okay? But the state defines you as Jewish. It's kind of like a white person in the U.S. going around saying, I'm not white, right? You know what those kind of people are, right? They're people who are denying their own privilege, and that's what it is to deny being a Jew in Israel, right? Whereas the question of whether you're Jewish or not in the U.S. is an entirely different question. It's much more of a question of choice, as of course it should be, right? This is a more normal situation, right? People are not, nobody forces you to be Jewish if you don't want to, thank God, right? And vice versa, right? Especially in Reform communities, which are much bigger in the U.S. than they are in Israel, you can be a Jew if you want to be a Jew, right? And so this question of Jewishness, of what it means to be Jewish, is really, really different in the two countries. And I think it's important when we're trying to build solidarity between the Jewish left in the U.S. and what we might call the Jewish left in Israel, though we don't use that term, because it's just the left, right? Or it's not the Palestinian left, right? Which is bigger than the Jewish left. Anyway, I don't know if that gets if that answers your question at all. I was kind of ranting a little bit, but this stuff is important for me because I'm an American Israeli, an Israeli American. We just had a resolution passed in the California state legislature, congratulating us Israeli Americans on what exactly, David?
On our wonderful contributions to California, to California environmental policy and water technology and high tech and declaiming.
Okay, that's enough. As an Israeli American, I can tell you Israeli Americans are the worst. We're really the worst. We don't deserve any sort of congratulation at all. Okay, so I'll end on that.
Hello, Colin. Come here and ask your question. Thank you for those lovely responses.
Hi, I'm Colin. A lot of you know me. I'm here. I'm Jewish. I'm a revolutionary unionist, as you can see from my shirt. What role do you think the Israeli state played in suppressing or undermining the PLO and giving more support to Hamas and kind of creating this I think I've heard kind of whispers that was a thing that happened, and I'd like to know more about that, and I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts are about that.
So I've read a lot, actually. I haven't read a lot. I've read a few articles actually about the subject, and I know in the beginning some Israeli from the intelligence circles did mention that the PLO, unlike actually for years and years, Israel has been trying to pin, different stigmas on the PLO. They're Islamist, even before Hamas was in existence. They're anti-Semite. They're this. The fact is that really the PLO was a secularist organization, even within that in the region, and somewhat democratically representative, considering the Palestinian situation. We had a really complicated calculations there. They wanted to have an antithesis to the PLO. And, having the PLO without any religious agenda, basically calling, this is not, because they always contended that Israel wanted it to be really a religious war. And the PLO has been saying, no, this is not about the religion. It's about the rights of Palestinian. It's a simple question about the theft of land. It's about right of people, human rights. And they found, now I don't want to say that Hamas was the making of Israel. That's not true. Those are people who are revolutionary in their own way. They chose a theological path to their struggle, but they were given some facilitation by the Israeli government. So at a time when there was a rounding up of Palestinian activists, when the Islamists were rising, those were kept aside. They were not touched. Their resources were not touched. At the same time, those of the PLO, if anybody was part of the, belonged to any of the PLO factions, they rounded up, they ended up they spent years in prisons. So there was some sort of facilitation. But it was sort of like the same mistake the United States in Afghanistan with the Taliban. They got the genie out of the bottle, and now they cannot put it back. But that is not to say that I'm discrediting Hamas by any way. Israel thought that they could actually pull a ploy on the Palestinian. It did create some schism within the Palestinian, as evident of what happened in Gaza and the split in the Palestinian now between Gaza and the West Bank, etc. And they hope to keep it as such because it's easier to manage, to have Gaza as its own country or territory and the West Bank. That's a wonderful scenario for them, divide and conquer. It's the simplest trick in the book, right? But now Hamas has its own agenda, and actually they have been politically getting more sophisticated. Their opinion, their politics has been changing and evolving over the year. I mean, I have really to give them some credit. I don't belong to Hamas, or neither was I a supporter of Hamas, but to their credit, they've come a long way, even in terms of their politics.
I'd just like to add quickly that this period when Hamas was becoming more prominent, with, to a certain degree, help and encouragement from the Israeli authorities, was the time when the PLO, under Fatah leadership, was going full bore into a more diplomatic initiative, had pretty much left the armed struggle of the 60s and early 70s behind, and had accepted, as Yassar said earlier, the idea of having Palestinian independence in whatever part of the country could be achieved. It was full acceptance of the two-state solution in 1988 officially, but it was even preceded by pretty much de facto acceptance of that. That was the time when Hamas had a certain amount of encouragement from the Israelis to, on the one hand, try to, because I think that diplomatic posture from the PLO was much more threatening to Israel than the armed struggle, which could easily be dismissed as terrorist, right? So allowing Hamas to arise during that period, I think, was no coincidence.
Thank you, both Yassar and David. To me, I think that it's not uncommon for an oppressor to want to manufacture an enemy that they perceive as easy to fight, or easier to message against anyway. I think that as a parallel in the US, I think that a lot of Black Lives Matter activists have been discredited in similar ways, obviously under totally different circumstances. But also, I think about unionization and Chris Smalls, when he was working to unionize his warehouse at Amazon, Amazon execs were like, great, this, they used every racist trope in the book about like, oh, this person isn't eloquent, oh, this person isn't this, that, and the other. This person's going to be very easy to message against, without understanding that that's exactly what appeals to many members of the working class. So, and now, he's speaking in front of Congress. So I think that I don't think that the trick works long term. You can't construct an enemy in that way and expect it. Having trouble articulating this, but constructed enemies are not going to be easier to fight, because a lot of times that is what creates the basis of a greater movement, and it's the underestimation of that power in the first place that gets the oppressors into trouble and gives folks an opening. So those are my thoughts on that. But please, welcome. Thank you for bearing with us being next to a comedy club.
Oh, is that what's going on?
Yeah.
I have a question about inside of Israel, the whole cultural landscape. There used to be a leftist writer, I don't know whether Harass, the newspaper, is that how it's pronounced? Haaretz. Used to have great writers that were leftist. You mentioned the word neoliberal, and I know that writers like Oz and Ari, the guy who wrote My Israel,
Ari Shavit.
yeah, they all started out very, what I would consider leftist, and now they're, the book My Israel became nothing more than a pan, a glorification of Israel rather than any kind of cultural, cognate look at the country. I mean, what's happened to the cultural component of the left in Israel?
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I haven't read that book. Ari Shavit was also, speaking of sexual assault and harassment, he's also outed as a sexual predator a couple of years ago. So yeah, not a leftist by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we've discussed a little bit, and Yassar has discussed this, and David has mentioned that it bears defining what it is, what we mean by leftist in Israel, right? In the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, it isn't being used in the same sense that it's used in the US. It has nothing to do with socialism. It has nothing to do with class politics. But it's basically just a measure of how much one is willing to consider any sort of compromise or settlement with the Palestinians, as Yassar had said. It didn't always mean this, but it has meant this for the last 30 or 40 years. And people like the people you mentioned, Amos Oz, who died a few years back, and who was also apparently an abusive father, according to his daughter. Anyway, not necessarily related to the question, but these people, Ari Shavit, these people are, I think, in the American sense, it's much more appropriate to call them liberals than it is to call them leftists, right? And Haaretz is a newspaper which still exists. Actually, full disclosure, my partner is a journalist at Haaretz, and it's a liberal newspaper. It's not a leftist newspaper by any stretch. She's a leftist, but her views are not the views of her employer, as we say. So liberalism is a class politics also, right? And it's a politics of the middle class and of the upper middle class. And one that is still alive and well in Israel. I think we mentioned the government changing, right? With Netanyahu is no longer prime minister. He was prime minister for a very long time, and now we have a government led by Naftali Bennett, which is, in terms of its class composition, it's actually quite cohesive. All the parties that are represented in the government, not including Ra'am, the Islamist Palestinian party, but all the other ones, from Meretz, the left Zionist party, all the way to Yamina, the right-wing party that Bennett belongs to, are all liberal and even neoliberal in terms of their class politics, right? And this is what is actually coherent and cohesive about this government, in terms of the budget that they're passing, which is a very neoliberal and right-wing budget, etc. Whereas with the Netanyahu government, the previous government, it actually included parties who represent working-class constituencies. Now, they're not left-wing parties by any stretch of the imagination, such as Shas, for example, which is a fundamentalist Jewish party, but they do represent working-class constituencies, and they do, when they're in power, make sure to have some redistribution going on to support their constituencies, which are often very poor. So what has happened to the culture of the left in Israel? I mean, so I'm a Marxist, and I think that, and I believe that ideology and consciousness and culture are basically reflections of a deeper kind of state of things, which has to do with political economy and with classes. And I think what happened is that the upper middle classes, and especially the capitalist class in Israeli society, which during the 1990s thought that a peace process was going to be in its best interest because it would open up the markets of the Middle East, was actually attracted by another vision. It was attracted by a vision that was first articulated by Ariel Sharon and then later articulated by Benjamin Netanyahu, which said, well, no, we're not going to have that new Middle East that Shimon Peres promised you in the 1990s, but what we will have is a new model of capitalism which is based on surveillance, which is based on militarism, which is based on arms, on an arms industry and on a tech industry, which is very, very closely related to the arms industry. And this is what the Israeli economy has become based on in the last 20 years. It's really important to understand Israeli society today, okay? The tech sector, which again is very closely related to the defense sector and very closely related to the arms sector, is booming. And if you have a job in the tech sector in Israel, you're well off. And it's quite a big part of the population. And that sector is very, again, I'm saying this for the third or fourth time, is very closely related to the military, is very closely related to the kind of military-industrial complex, and so they have an interest in war. They have an interest in the occupation continuing, right? Israeli arms companies, they try their weapons in the West Bank, right? It's a laboratory for them, and then they sell them abroad. And they don't just sell them in the U.S. They sell them in India. They sell them in Brazil. They sell them all over the world, right? Ukraine, okay? And you know, business is good. War is good business. So this is just another reason why socialist politics needs to also be an anti-imperialist politics, right? Because capitalism loves war. War solves a lot of problems for it. It solves a lot of problems when you have excess production capacity. It solves a lot of political problems because you can shut things down when you have a war, right? You can shut dissent down, and this is why in the long term and at the global level, socialist politics, working class politics, left-wing politics is anti-war politics, is anti-imperialist politics, is anti-militarist politics. These things go together.
Thank you, Matan. Do we have any more audience questions? Does not look like it. Oh, you do. Colin, come back.
You guys might have to stop me at some point. I could ask questions just like till like early morning hours, but this is gonna be a complicated one. I think I actually will make it the last one for me, but so over in Syria, you have this whole thing that that is happening in like northern Syria, which has a lot to do with like the political philosophy and practice of that project that some people call Rojava. Now they want people to call it the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria to put less of an emphasis on the Kurdish character. Is like that political philosophy is kind of like a bottom-up democracy meant to be like very feminist, or they have their own terminology for it, but very pro women's liberation, and then also kind of facilitate this like cooperation between these ethnic groups, which is can be seen as very precarious because a lot of them have like historically been at each other's throats, like the Kurds and the Armenians, for example, and Israel is like not. Or Israel-Palestine is like not a totally dissimilar area that's like not that far away, and so I'm wondering, has there been any thought of like, and I've seen it on some corners of the internet, but like to what extent in Israel-Palestine has there been like thought about like adapting this philosophy of like democratic confederalism and kind of seeing what it could do in Israel-Palestine, and I would also say like Lebanon too as well.
So the Confederacy actually solution has been proposed before about, but actually Confederacy, well, I've heard it actually both sides, between Palestine and the Jordanian as a solution, and that was actually a solution that probably the Israeli would have favored, to take the Palestinian population and have it being annexed to Jordan. Maybe they would have liked that, but also I've heard actually some articles about confederation between or in Israel-Palestine. Everything's been theoretical. There is no base. You have an addition.
Sorry, I don't mean to be impolite, but it's the philosophy that they have is not really like, I think you're talking about a different meaning of the word confederation. Their version of confederation is more like it's kind of it's tough to it's more like things. There would be less of a unitary state overall, and it would be more like solving problems on like the very local level, like the street level, the neighborhood level, and stuff like that. And then if absolutely necessary, there could be like a higher level like federation that could solve, pressing issues, but it wouldn't be able to overrule local decisions. Stuff that would be kind of more about what it's like. So it's not about like creating separate political entities for ethnic groups. It's kind of the opposite.
So as I was talking earlier, without having I don't like to talk about hypotheses, although sometimes, a dream is could start a revolution. But there is no social setting or culture for that right now that I see. Like, nobody's talking about these as basis for solutions. Unless, do you have something to add? I don't see anything really fundamentally viable on the ground to build such a solution. It's not even being talked about. We've talked. I've heard different scenarios about having, the what's being debated now is the one-state solution, two-state solution. So those who still believe in a two-state solution, And then you have the fundamentalists who are talking about the one-color state solution on both sides, meaning Jewish only or Palestinian only. I mean, these are the only scenarios that being talked to that has forces on the ground that talk about that. But there is nothing, entertaining that scenario.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I tend to agree with Yassar's sort of a pessimistic answer to your question. I think Rojava has been an inspiration. I mean, not so much in the last few years because of how badly things have been going in Syria, but certainly at earlier stages of the struggle for the left globally, I think, and to a certain extent for the radical left in Israel, for people I hang out with, and again, we're a pretty small minority. And I think it's good to always kind of be developing new ideas. Of course, speaking of confederacies, Matzpen and many of their interlocutors on the Palestinian and Arab left in the 70s were talking about a socialist confederation of the Middle East, right, of the entire Middle East. That's obviously a very far away kind of vision right now. But just as I was saying before, I think it's important to have these sorts of even utopian visions to give us the sense of direction of where we're marching towards. But within Israeli society, Yassar can speak better than I can about Palestinian society. Within Israeli society, together, at this moment, we're so far away from that sort of thing. I think among the majority of Israelis, for example, right now you have something that would be completely ordinary in any other country, which is one of the parties in the government is considering leaving the government, and that might make the government fall in a parliamentary regime such as you have in many European countries. And people are freaking out. Why? Because it's an Arab party, right? It's inconceivable to many Jewish Israelis that an Arab party should be holding that sort of power within the government. So the idea of having an Arab or Palestinian prime minister, for example, is like science fiction to many Israelis, right? And dystopian science fiction. They're afraid of it. They're worried about it. So we have a really long way to go before we can start talking about democratic confederalism and that sort of thing, right? We have to normalize. Among most Israelis, you have to normalize this idea that somebody of a different race than you might actually hold political power. Right? The U.S. had its first black president a little while back, right? And that was a sort of revolutionary, or maybe not revolutionary, that's not the word for it, but it was an important achievement, I think, for racial equality, victory for racial equality. We're still so far away from that in Israel right now. That this idea that you might have a Palestinian prime minister, Ayman Odeh, who's the head of the Joint List, the left-wing Palestinian party, said a couple of years back, yeah, I would like to be prime minister one day, right? And people freaked out, right? So I'm with you on these sorts of kind of utopian ideas, but it's important to understand that we're really pretty far away from that right now. Lillian, did we miss part of your question? Because
Israeli suppression of the left.
About Israeli suppression of the left, was that part of your question? Hasbara.
Are there any similar groups on the anti-Zionist left in Israel that have faced obstacles in doing the same? That's what my question is.
You mean obstacles from the Israeli state?
Or from pushback from Jewish communities or those other organizations or just anything?
So maybe this is a question for David, actually, because these ties used to be a lot stronger than they are now. My late grandfather, Reuven, who David knew well, in the 80s ran something sort of media project called Israel Left, which was kind of trying to connect the Israeli left to the American left. And these things I think they were much more developed back when the Israeli left was slightly stronger, and also when I think the American left was more kind of amenable to creating these connections with the Israeli left than it is now. So it may be something that we need to look into, kind of reestablishing. I think it's really important, and I would love to have more conversations with DSA members about how to do that.
Well, it's true that the Israeli left is weak now, and I worked on that publication when I lived in Jerusalem when I first got there. It was very low tech, but it was very valuable. But I think that in a way there's really more of that available now. I'm kind of obsessive and single-minded sometimes about following the Israeli left and developments in Palestine and Israel in general. But there are, lots and lots of webinars, meetings, connections where there have been speakers from various parts of the Israeli left and the Palestinian left whom I'm able to hear through the wonders of Zoom. And when I hear about those, sometimes I mention them in the DSA International Slack, and maybe I should do that more. But there really are a lot of opportunities, as little as going on in the Israeli left. I feel it's very easy to plug into it if you want to.
Maybe I will say one more thing, because we've been talking about various senses of the word left here. There are groups like, for example, Breaking the Silence, and If Not Now, no, If Not Now is an American group, but anyway, various other Israeli groups which they're not left in the socialist sense, right? They're just left in the pro-peace sense, and they're actually quite well connected in the U.S. And they do, no shade to them. I think it's very important work that they're doing, but they're not class-conscious, working-class socialist groups. And I think as socialists, as left-wingers in that sense, we have a lot of work to do to reestablish these connections, which have kind of died off in the last few years. And this is and Palestinians need to be a part of this also. It's not about the Israeli leftists connecting with American leftists and shutting Palestinians out of the conversation. It's about building these multilateral ties, with the rest of the world as well, with the third world, with the global south as well, among socialists. Because as socialists, like I said before, we understand, I think, better than liberals do why this sort of thing is so critical, is so important.
And I would add actually one thing to that as well. One of the greatest nightmare for Israel today is that they have a feeling that they're losing the Jewish support in America, especially among the young Jewish. And I actually, I could relate to that. I mean, we have the Jewish Voice for Peace, we have the Anti-Zionist, we have even actually Students for Justice in Palestine. Many of their members actually are Jews. So probably your grandfather's project should be reignited, and seriously, because I believe if with the left being struggling so much in Israel, probably it would help to have the support of the American Jewry to amplify their sound and their voice. So it's something really we could count on, and we count on you, Colin.
We're working on it.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you for putting up with being chilly, because it's worth it. And this was an amazing panel, and I'm really grateful all of you were here to be able to do this. And you should definitely take one of David's BDS cards to sign up for the boycott. And you should also take some food and make sure you sign our sign-in sheet before you get out of here. Does anyone have... Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Claire in particular, for helping to organize this on behalf of the DSA Chapter Executive. Thanks to Ian, and I'm sorry, I don't know your colleague's name.
Devin.
Devin, for setting up all this high-tech stuff. If the recording comes out well and everybody agrees, we'll post it so people who couldn't make it or who were afraid of the cold and the rain that we held off didn't see it. And I just also like to mention that the food was from a really new restaurant that I recommend. It's called Basha Taste of Jerusalem I don't know the exact address, but it's on Fulton near El Camino. And it was paid for thanks to the estate of May de Marie, who some of you veterans may know of. She was a longtime peace and justice advocate in Sacramento who left some money for this kind of thing, and we used it to bring the food tonight. And thank you all for coming. Actually,
and I'd like to say actually something to our guest Matan here. It's natural for somebody who comes from oppressed peoples to be naturally revolutionary and to want to fight for justice and for peace and equality. It's another to be part of the invaders' legacy and to really stand up for your own people, try to correct course. It takes lots of courage. Those brave few in the Israeli left, I salute them, and I look forward to living side by side with them in the future. Inshallah.
Thank you again. If you took a blanket, please just set it in one of the laundry baskets by the door, and be sure to take some food if you want some food. Have a good night.